It was supposed to be just another day. Tanya Lewis, an ordinary woman in her late 30s, was on her way to another routine work trip. A dedicated employee at a small but respected tech firm in her city, Tanya had built a life centered around hard work, family, and a steady routine. As she stood in front of the mirror that morning, brushing her natural curls back into a neat ponytail, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Her flight to New York was just another part of her job, and she had grown accustomed to the hustle of airport security lines and tight schedules. Little did she know, this flight would change everything. The morning air was crisp as Tanya locked her apartment door and stepped into the busy city streets. Her Uber ride to the airport was uneventful, the usual chatter with the driver about the weather and traffic. Tanya wasn't the type to be easily distracted or anxious. Her calm and collected demeanor was part of what made her so effective at work. Still, something lingered in the back of her mind as she watched the city skyline fade into the distance. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't heard from her daughter, Maya, who had just started high school. Or maybe it was just the fatigue from months of non-stop travel. Either way, she brushed it off as nothing more than a fleeting thought. At the airport, the usual buzz of travelers and flight announcements filled the air. Tanya moved with purpose, knowing exactly where to go. Her ticket was in hand, the flight number memorized, and she breezed through check-in, security, and the long terminal. Her bag, neatly packed with clothes and work materials, was checked without incident. There were no delays, no complications, just the steady march of time as she moved toward the gate. She paused for a moment before boarding, scanning the sea of people around her. Some faces were familiar, business travelers hunched over their phones, parents wrangling toddlers, and a few people who looked as if they might be on the same flight. Tanya had learned to read people in her line of work, to spot the signs of discomfort or distress in others. She was just that type of person, attentive, aware, and prepared. She didn't feel a sense of danger, not yet, but there was something in the air that she couldn't place. It wasn't a feeling of unease, just an awareness of the day's monotony, as if everything was moving in slow motion. Once on the plane, she settled into her window seat. A polite exchange with the person next to her, a quick smile to the flight attendant as she stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, it was all routine. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Tanya looked out at the sprawling city below, her thoughts drifting back to the meeting in New York. She had prepared for this trip for weeks, and now it was time to get down to business. The noise of the plane's engines hummed in the background, the vibrations in the seat beneath her a comfort she had grown used to over the years of travel. The world outside was blurry, but Tanya's mind was sharp and focused. She hadn't noticed it yet, but something unusual was about to unfold. Midway through the flight, as the plane leveled out and the cabin lights dimmed, Tanya felt the slightest shift in the atmosphere. A sudden tension, subtle yet unmistakable. The flight attendants, who had been casually moving up and down the aisle, began to speak in hushed tones, glancing occasionally toward the back of the plane. Tanya tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but it was difficult to ignore. She tried to concentrate on her work, pulling out her laptop to review her notes for the meeting ahead, but her mind kept wandering back to the strange undercurrent of tension around her. It wasn't until about an hour into the flight that Tanya felt it, a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she turned to see a flight attendant standing behind her, a polite but firm look on her face. Tanya glanced around, but the rest of the passengers appeared to be oblivious to the exchange. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said quietly. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Tanya blinked in confusion. "Is everything okay? We need to speak with you for a moment." "It's just a routine check." "Routine check?" Tanya's heart skipped a beat. Everything she knew about flying told her that if a flight attendant was speaking to her directly and asking her to leave her seat, something was off. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't been disruptive, hadn't drawn attention to herself, hadn't even gotten up for a drink. What was going on? Still, she stood up and followed the flight attendant, feeling the eyes of the other passengers on her back. She tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the more she walked toward the front of the plane, the more her sense of unease grew. The flight attendant led her to a small, curtained-off section of the plane where a second flight attendant stood with a serious expression. "We just need to verify some details with you," the first attendant explained, her tone polite but unwavering. Tanya's pulse quickened as she processed the situation, wondering if perhaps they had mistaken her for someone else. Maybe she had left a bag unattended or had done something else without realizing. Whatever it was, she was about to find out. The attendant's words were lost in the hum of the airplane's engines as Tanya stood, nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The second flight attendant reached for her carry-on bag, the one Tanya had placed in the overhead compartment when she boarded the plane. As the attendant rummaged through it, Tanya watched, confused and increasingly anxious. She couldn't think of a single reason why this was happening. "Is something wrong?" Tanya asked, her voice shaking just a little now. "Please, ma'am," the second flight attendant replied, "just a few more minutes." But those few minutes stretched into eternity. Tanya felt trapped, her mind racing as she replayed every interaction she had that morning. Had she done something wrong? Was there something in her bag that shouldn't have been there? She had packed carefully, hadn't she? Her heart began to race. The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. And then, just as Tanya was about to ask again what was happening, the flight attendant suddenly stopped. The hum of the engines seemed louder in the silence that followed. She had found something. A small, black object, wrapped in cloth, was pulled from the bag. Tanya stared at it, her mind struggling to process the scene. The flight attendant's face had changed, just slightly, but enough for Tanya to see the shift. The calm exterior that had once been there was gone now. The attendant's eyes were focused, intense, and something else, something she couldn't place, seemed to be happening beneath the surface. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you to come with us immediately," the attendant said. Tanya's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. What had she done wrong? What was that thing? What was happening? Everything she thought she knew about air travel, about her own life, was crashing down around her in that moment. As Tanya followed the flight attendant toward the rear of the plane, she tried to gather her thoughts, but panic was setting in. This wasn't just some routine check. She could feel it now. This wasn't the kind of situation that could be easily explained away. The flight attendants were acting differently now, and the atmosphere had shifted completely. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. As Tanya walked down the narrow aisle, the flight attendants led her to a seat at the rear of the plane, where a couple of other crew members were waiting. The quiet murmur of conversations among the passengers was interrupted by the rustling of the overhead compartments, as if everyone was subconsciously aware of the scene unfolding. Tanya's anxiety climbed with every step, her mind spinning with thoughts she could barely control. What was going on? What had she done? The strange object from her bag, it had to be some sort of mistake, didn't it? One of the attendants motioned for her to sit in an empty seat, their faces now serious. Tanya hesitated for a moment, casting a quick glance back down the aisle. She was surrounded by strangers, people who had been her fellow passengers just moments ago, but now they seemed like distant, faceless figures, their eyes fixed on her, some with concern, others with a strange sense of intrigue. She was acutely aware of their gaze. Tanya had always been an ordinary person. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, certainly not in such a tense and awkward situation. The flight attendants spoke in low, hushed tones, exchanging glances that made Tanya's pulse race even faster. She could hear the distant hum of the engines, the rush of air as the plane soared through the sky, but everything around her felt muffled, as though she were inside a bubble of fear. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some questions," one of the attendants said, her voice clipped. "We need to confirm your identity and details about the bag you were carrying." Tanya could barely process what she was hearing. Her mind raced to find an explanation. The bag? She hadn't packed anything strange, anything illegal. There was nothing in there that should have raised suspicion. She glanced at the door of the cockpit ahead, but the flight attendants moved to block her line of sight. The walls of the small seating area seemed to close in on her as they all began to gather around her, making it feel like she was under siege. "I don't understand," Tanya said, her voice shaking. "There must be some mistake. What is it that's in my bag? I haven't done anything wrong." One of the attendants remained silent, but the other finally spoke up, her tone colder than before. "We need to search your bag, ma'am. This is a serious matter." Her words hung in the air, and Tanya felt the weight of them sink deep into her chest. Tanya opened her mouth to protest, but she was interrupted by a firm knock on the door behind her. A man entered the small space, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He was a police officer, she realized immediately, and his presence sent a new wave of tension crashing through her. What was going on? She wasn't prepared for this kind of interaction. She wasn't a criminal. She hadn't been involved in anything that could justify this level of scrutiny. The officer's eyes briefly met hers, his face hard and professional, but there was no warmth, no hint of understanding in his gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but stern. "We need to speak with you about what's in your bag." The flight attendant stepped aside as the officer took a seat across from Tanya, the tension in the air palpable. Tanya's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts jumbled as she struggled to find words. What was happening? She was still clinging to the hope that this was all just a misunderstanding, that any moment now someone would apologize for the confusion, and she could return to her seat and finish her flight in peace. "Can you please explain to me why I was asked to follow you?" Tanya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to steady herself, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "I'm just a regular person. I don't know what's going on." The officer looked at her, studying her face for a long moment, as though weighing his response. Tanya felt a chill crawl down her spine as she waited, holding her breath. "We found something in your bag, ma'am," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate. "We need to know what it is." The officer's words were like a punch to the gut. Tanya's world spun as the shock of his statement hit her. The thing in her bag, what was it? The small, black object wrapped in cloth, was it a weapon? Was it something dangerous? Her mind struggled to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. She hadn't packed anything unusual. Maybe it was a gift or something left behind by mistake. She had to stay calm. "Please," Tanya pleaded, her voice cracking. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't put anything in there that's illegal." But the officer didn't respond. Instead, he nodded toward the attendants. One of them, the same one who had first spoken to Tanya, stepped forward with a large, zippered evidence bag. Inside, Tanya could see the dark cloth they had taken from her bag. Her heart raced as the bag was opened, revealing a carefully wrapped package. Tanya's stomach dropped. She couldn't bring herself to look at it, even as the officer inspected it with growing concern. The officer held the package up for her to see, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice taking on an edge of suspicion. Tanya stared at the object but couldn't bring herself to say anything. It looked like a small, neatly wrapped bundle of cloth, but she couldn't identify what it was. She had no clue what was inside. I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "That's not mine. I didn't put anything like that in my bag." The officer's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, the tension in the small space increasing by the second. Tanya felt as though she were suffocating, the walls closing in around her with every passing second. "Are you sure about that?" the officer asked, his voice sharper now. Tanya looked up at him, feeling the weight of his gaze. Was he accusing her of something? Had they planted something in her bag? The thought sent a rush of panic through her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but she was beginning to realize that whatever was going on, it wasn't good. As the officer began to speak to the flight attendants, Tanya's mind reeled, her heart pounding in her ears. The small bundle in the evidence bag seemed to hold a mystery that she couldn't unravel. All she wanted was to get off this plane, to escape this surreal nightmare, but she couldn't. Not until she figured out what was happening, and why. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence, broken only by the occasional mutter from the officer or one of the attendants. Tanya's mind raced, trying to piece together any explanation. What was in that package? What had she done wrong? Had she been set up? As the officer continued to examine the contents of her bag, Tanya's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden realization. Could this be connected to something she had experienced recently? She had been in a few tense situations at work, dealing with people who had tried to sabotage her efforts, but nothing to this extreme. Could someone have planted something in her bag to frame her? But who? And why? The officer stood up abruptly, his face grim. "Ma'am, we need to take you into custody for further questioning." His voice was firm, and Tanya felt her world crumble. She had no idea what was coming next. The thought of being arrested, of having her life turned upside down, was unfathomable. She had no way of knowing just how deep this web of suspicion and confusion ran. Tanya's heart pounded in her chest as the officer's words sank in. "Take you into custody," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. This was happening, and she couldn't wrap her mind around it. How had her ordinary day turned into this nightmarish ordeal? Her palms were sweaty, her body frozen, as though she were outside of herself, watching it all unfold. The flight attendants, who had once seemed so friendly, now kept their distance, their faces devoid of empathy. One of them had already stepped away to radio something, her gaze flickering nervously between Tanya and the officer. They were treating her like a criminal. Tanya had been in some tough spots in her life, but never like this. She had always prided herself on being an upstanding citizen, someone who followed the rules. And yet, here she was, a woman accused of something she couldn't even understand. As the officer placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the small, confined area where the rest of the crew had gathered, Tanya felt the weight of the situation press down on her. She had no idea what was going on. Nothing made sense. Everything she had ever known was slipping through her fingers, and the reality of her situation started to sink in. The idea of being arrested on an airplane, in front of strangers, and for something she had no control over, was both terrifying and disorienting. "Ma'am, please come with me," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. Still, it did nothing to reassure her. She glanced behind her as the flight attendants exchanged murmurs and whispers, but none of them made eye contact with her. She felt isolated, completely alone in this mess. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind was fogged with panic, and her thoughts scattered in 1,000 different directions. What had they found in her bag? What was this all about? How had she become the target of suspicion in the first place? Every question led to more confusion, more fear. She couldn't fathom how it had escalated this quickly. As she was led to the back of the plane, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Passengers who had been oblivious to her predicament only moments ago now took notice. Some were staring, their eyes wide with curiosity, while others whispered to each other, their faces filled with judgment. Tanya's face burned with humiliation. Her heart felt like it was sinking into her stomach. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had never imagined that a routine flight, one of the simplest parts of her life, could suddenly become a nightmare. The officer's grip tightened slightly on her arm as they reached the small, isolated corner of the plane where the crew had cleared space. He motioned for her to sit in a cramped, uncomfortable seat. Tanya's knees buckled slightly as she lowered herself, her mind still reeling. The officer moved to the front of the plane, speaking briefly with the pilot, and then returned with an expression that seemed to darken the room. Tanya's breath hitched as she glanced at him, sensing that the situation was about to become even more complicated. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady but carrying a note of finality, "I'm afraid we need to detain you. We'll be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. The authorities will be waiting for you when we arrive." Tanya's world seemed to stop. Emergency landing? The thought of this simple flight turning into an emergency situation, one that involved a police presence and an uncertain future, was almost too much to bear. She wanted to scream, to protest, but her throat tightened, and the words wouldn't come. What was happening? Why her? How had it come to this? For a moment, Tanya felt a deep sense of isolation. She had no one to turn to, no one who understood what she was going through. The passengers around her seemed indifferent to her plight, almost as if she had become nothing more than a spectacle for their entertainment. The officer didn't speak again, but his eyes remained fixed on her, as though watching for any sign of resistance. Her mind raced as she tried to think through the chaos in her head. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? A mistake? She had traveled on planes countless times before, why was she being singled out now? It didn't make sense. The officer had said they found something in her bag, but what? Tanya's thoughts kept returning to that dark cloth, the small bundle they had pulled from her belongings. She couldn't get the image of it out of her mind. What was inside it? Why was it so important? Why had it caused such a drastic shift in the course of her life? The officer's words kept echoing in her mind, "We need to know what it is." What was she supposed to say to that? She didn't know what it was. How could she have packed something like that? How could she have known it was in her bag? In the midst of the confusion, Tanya remembered the moment she had packed her bag that morning. She had been in a rush, trying to get everything ready for her trip. It had been a normal morning, just like any other, until she had grabbed the last few items, her toiletries, her books, her jacket, and tossed them all into her carry-on bag. She hadn't thought about it much, she had done it 100 times before. Now, she wished she had taken more care, more time to check her things. Maybe she would have noticed something amiss. But no. It didn't make sense. She was sure her bag was packed just like any other day. Why would there be anything dangerous, anything suspicious in there? Why was this happening to her? As the plane continued its flight, Tanya could feel her world slipping further and further out of her control. The officer had returned to the front of the plane, speaking to the pilot once again. Tanya glanced out the small window beside her, watching the clouds stretch out endlessly below. They had to be near their destination, the emergency landing looming closer with every passing second. The flight attendants had stopped looking at her directly, but she could still feel their eyes on her. They were watching, but for what? Were they hoping she would crack under the pressure? Were they waiting for some sign of guilt, of wrongdoing? Tanya clenched her fists, trying to regain some sense of composure. This wasn't her fault. Whatever was going on, she was being dragged into something she didn't understand. But she couldn't let them see her break. She had to stay strong. Tanya felt her thoughts begin to settle, her pulse beginning to slow, even though the tension in the cabin had only grown. She knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. Her intuition told her this wasn't a simple case of a misunderstanding. There was something larger at play here, something she wasn't yet seeing. And no matter how much she wanted to believe this would all be sorted out by the time they landed, the growing pit in her stomach told her otherwise. This wasn't just a mistake, it was something more, something that could change everything for her. The officer returned shortly after, his expression grim. "We'll be landing shortly," he said, his voice final. "Prepare yourself." Tanya had no idea what was going to happen next. All she knew was that her life, as she had known it, was about to change. And whatever this mysterious object in her bag was, it held the key to a truth she couldn't yet understand. The emergency landing was only the beginning. The plane's descent began, its engines humming low, vibrating through the cabin. Tanya felt every inch of that descent in her chest, her stomach tightening with anxiety. The officer was quiet now, standing just a few feet away, his gaze sharp and calculating. Every movement he made seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if he was bracing for something monumental. Tanya's eyes flickered to the window again, the clouds now parting to reveal the ground below, an expanse of unknown territory she would soon be thrust into. Her heartbeat quickened, each thud a reminder that she was at the mercy of a situation she couldn't control. The emergency landing had come without warning, and now she had to face whatever awaited her on the ground. She could barely think. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, torn between hoping this was all some colossal misunderstanding and fearing that the truth was far worse than anything she could imagine. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as if trying to block out the reality of what was happening. The plane touched down with a jolt, its wheels hitting the tarmac in a rough, bumpy way that sent a shudder through the cabin. Tanya's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively gripped the armrests. The officer moved to the front of the plane, speaking quietly into a radio. Tanya strained to hear his words, but the hum of the aircraft, now slowing, drowned out most of the conversation. A cold sense of dread washed over her. The officers would be waiting for her as soon as they landed. This was no longer a simple flight, no longer a normal trip. Whatever had happened in that bag was going to change the course of her life. The plane rolled to a stop, and the cabin lights flickered, signaling that the seatbelt sign was off. The flight attendants, who had remained in the shadows since the officer had arrived, now moved swiftly through the aisle, preparing for what was about to unfold. Tanya's throat tightened, her mouth dry. She could feel the stares of the passengers, the awkward silence hanging in the air. No one spoke, but their gazes followed her every move. As the jet bridge connected to the door and the stairway to the terminal opened, the officers began to board the plane, their uniforms striking against the sterile backdrop of the cabin. Tanya's heart raced. She couldn't make out their faces, but she didn't need to. The tension was palpable, and the realization of how real this had all become hit her like a freight train. There was no turning back now. She was about to face the unknown, and the officers weren't there to explain, they were there to take action. The officer who had been watching her the entire flight stepped forward, his face grim, his eyes hard. He motioned for her to stand, his voice low and direct. "Ma'am, we need to escort you off the plane now. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Tanya didn't resist, though her body felt heavy and unresponsive. As she rose, the sudden sensation of standing up too quickly made her dizzy. She had to steady herself, clutching the back of a nearby seat to regain her balance. Every move felt deliberate, as if all eyes were on her, watching for any sign of defiance, any clue that she was guilty of whatever they suspected. She felt small under their scrutiny, a woman who had once had control over her own life, now nothing more than a suspect in a case she didn't even understand. The officer's grip on her arm was firm as he guided her toward the exit, his hand never leaving her side. Tanya could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs dangling from his belt, a reminder of what could happen if she didn't comply. The terminal ahead seemed distant, blurry, as if she were walking through a fog. She tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but everything felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream. The harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal greeted her like a harsh slap, and the echo of footsteps on the cold tile floors seemed to amplify the growing dread within her. As they approached the gate, the full weight of the situation began to crash down on her. The officers who had boarded the plane were now flanking her, their faces unreadable. Tanya could feel their gaze, but she dared not meet it. She knew what they were thinking, what she was thinking. What could be in her bag that had caused all this? What was it that had sparked such suspicion? She had never done anything wrong in her life, never broken a law. She wasn't some criminal. She wasn't a danger. She was just Tanya. Ordinary, everyday Tanya, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was led through the terminal, her footsteps hollow in the empty hallway. Passengers were waiting at the gate, some of them glancing over at her as she passed. A few of them looked confused, others seemed concerned, but none of them dared to speak. Tanya couldn't blame them. After all, they didn't know what was happening. All they saw was a woman being escorted through an airport by two officers, her expression a mixture of confusion and terror. The air in the terminal felt colder than it should have, and the smell of antiseptic and coffee filled her nose. Tanya's mind kept returning to the same question: what was in her bag? What had triggered this chain of events? It had been such an ordinary day, until it hadn't been. She had boarded the flight with nothing more than her luggage, her thoughts on her destination, maybe the business meeting or the family reunion she was planning to attend. The simplicity of it now seemed like a distant memory. She was led into a small room at the back of the airport, a room that felt more like an interrogation space than a holding area. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, casting a harsh light on everything in the sterile space. Tanya was instructed to sit in a chair, the metal cold against her skin. The officer stood nearby, his eyes never leaving her, as if he expected her to try something, anything, to escape this reality. But Tanya wasn't thinking about escape. She was thinking about what had led her to this point, what she had done wrong to get here. Minutes felt like hours. The officers stood in silence, occasionally glancing at one another, and Tanya sat motionless, her mind reeling. She couldn't figure out the answer, couldn't comprehend what had gone wrong. And then, as if in a dream, the door opened. A man in plain clothes stepped in, his face calm but intense. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer any pleasantries. He went straight to the point. "We need to talk about the contents of your bag," he said, his voice measured and firm. "What exactly did you have in there?" Tanya swallowed hard. The question felt like a punch in the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She couldn't think of anything to say. The man seemed to sense her confusion and impatience, so he continued. "We'll find out soon enough. Don't worry, you won't be left in the dark much longer. But for now, just tell us what's inside." His eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, Tanya felt a flicker of doubt. What was happening? What had she brought into this airport? Her head was spinning, her thoughts tangled in knots. Was it possible that she was somehow involved in something she didn't understand? How could she explain the mystery in her bag? I don't know," Tanya finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "I don't know what's in there." The man's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll find out soon enough." Tanya's world was collapsing. The truth, whatever it was coming for her. And she had no idea what it would reveal. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Tanya sat in that sterile, cold room, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her pulse pounding in her temples. She had told them she didn't know what was in the bag, but the officers weren't convinced. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, never left her. They were waiting, watching for any crack in her resolve, any flicker of doubt or guilt. But Tanya didn't have an answer for them. The confusion that had plagued her since the moment she stepped onto the plane still gripped her heart. She wasn't guilty, she wasn't a criminal, but that didn't seem to matter to them. The man in plain clothes, who had stepped into the room just moments ago, hadn't said much more after his question. He stood across from her, his arms crossed, his face impassive. Every now and then, he glanced at the door, as though expecting someone. Tanya didn't know who he was waiting for, but she knew that whoever it was, they weren't going to be friendly. The door clicked open, and Tanya's breath caught in her throat. Two more officers entered, their presence filling the small room with a heavy, oppressive weight. One of them held a small black bag, her bag. Tanya's stomach dropped. It felt as though the world had slowed to a crawl. The bag was in their hands, the very same one that had caused this entire nightmare. She had carried it without a second thought, never imagining that it would lead to this moment. The man in plain clothes didn't waste any time. He motioned for the officers to place the bag on the table between them. Tanya's eyes stayed locked on the bag, her thoughts racing. What had they found? What could possibly be so dangerous or suspicious? She felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She wanted to stand up, to scream that she didn't know what was inside. But she couldn't. The fear that gripped her body kept her rooted to the chair, unable to move or speak. The officer in plain clothes unzipped the bag slowly, as though savoring the moment. Tanya's heart pounded in her ears as he pulled out the first item, a neatly folded jacket. It was hers, she recognized it instantly. She had packed it just the night before, unsure if she would need it for the chilly weather in her destination city. The officer glanced at her but didn't speak. His eyes flicked to the next item, then the next. Each one seemed more innocent than the last. Her phone charger. A book she had been meaning to finish. A bottle of water. Nothing that seemed remotely dangerous. Or suspicious. But then the officer pulled out a small, unmarked box, tucked at the bottom of the bag, hidden beneath her clothes. Tanya froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. The officers noticed her reaction immediately. The man in plain clothes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he placed the box on the table. "Do you want to explain this?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with a certain weight that made Tanya's stomach churn. Tanya opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had no idea what the box was, no idea how it had ended up in her bag. Her mind raced, but the answer didn't come. The box was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and covered in plain brown wrapping. There was no label, no identifying marks of any kind. It looked entirely ordinary, but something about the way the officer was staring at it made it seem like a ticking time bomb. "I don't know what that is," Tanya finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't put it there." The officer didn't respond right away. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. He looked back down at the box, his fingers hovering over it. Tanya's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what was inside that box, but every fiber of her being screamed that it wasn't good. Why would someone put something like that in her bag? How could this have happened? The man in plain clothes motioned for the officer to open it. Tanya's breath came in shallow gasps as the officer carefully peeled back the wrapping. Her mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. Was it something illegal? Dangerous? Something that could change everything in her life in an instant? The officer's hands moved with slow precision, and when the wrapping came off, the box's contents were revealed. It wasn't what Tanya had expected. Inside the box was a series of carefully arranged photographs, dozens of them. Some were of her, though she didn't recognize when they had been taken. They were candid shots, taken in public places, without her knowledge. Some pictures showed her walking down the street. Others showed her in cafes, in shops, even leaving her apartment building. But it wasn't just pictures of her that were in the box. There were also photographs of several other people Tanya didn't know. Strangers. But the images were disturbing, showing them in vulnerable, compromising positions. Some seemed like surveillance photos, others looked like intimate, personal moments that had been captured without consent. Tanya's mouth went dry as her eyes scanned the photos. She felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under her. How could this be? Who had done this? Why was she being targeted like this? The officer in plain clothes noticed her reaction and leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Do you Recognize anyone in these photos? He asked. Tanya shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No. I don't. I don't know these people. He didn't respond, but the silence between them was thick, pregnant with unspoken questions. Tanya felt exposed, as though every part of her life was being laid bare, scrutinized by strangers. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. How could this happen? She wasn't involved in anything shady. She had never been involved in anything like this. It didn't make sense. The man in plain clothes leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her. This, he said slowly, is a very serious situation. We'll need to investigate further, but you need to understand something. Someone has been watching you. And they've been following you for a long time. Tanya's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled. Who? Why? The questions burned in her brain, but she couldn't find the words to ask them. She felt utterly helpless, like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The world had tilted on its axis, and now she was caught in the middle of something much bigger than herself. The door opened again, and another officer entered, his expression grim. He spoke to the man in plain clothes in hushed tones, and though Tanya couldn't hear the conversation, the look on the officer's face was enough to tell her that whatever was in the box had made things much worse. The room felt suffocating. Tanya had no idea what to do next. She had no answers, no explanation for what had happened. The truth, whatever it was slowly closing in on her, and she was no closer to understanding it than she had been when she first stepped onto the plane. You're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this, the man in plain clothes said, his voice low and commanding. He didn't need to say anything more. Tanya knew that her life, her freedom, everything she had known, was hanging by a thread. The weight of it was suffocating. She could feel her world crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the officers continued to investigate, Tanya sat in the cold, sterile room, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had she done to deserve this? What had she gotten herself mixed up in? And who was behind all of this? The answers were just out of reach, but one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. Tanya's world was spiraling. The walls of the interrogation room felt as though they were closing in on her. The cold, fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting a sterile, unnatural glow that seemed to accentuate the dread settling in her chest. She sat, motionless, as her mind raced. She couldn't think straight. Every time she tried to focus on the facts, the flood of images, the photos, the box, the surveillance, came crashing back, drowning out all coherent thought. She was being framed for something she didn't even understand, and with every passing moment, it became clearer that whoever was behind this had planned it meticulously. The police had no answers. No one could tell her why she was being targeted, and yet the evidence, those disturbing photographs, spoke volumes. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Tanya had been left alone in the sterile room for what seemed like an eternity. The silence was deafening. It gave her too much time to think, and each thought was more maddening than the last. Who was behind this? Why had they chosen her? And who were the other people in those photographs? She had never seen them before in her life. But the unsettling truth kept coming back, someone had been watching her. Someone knew her every move. Every step she took. And now, they had orchestrated an elaborate setup, and she was the one who was going to pay for it. Eventually, the door opened, and the man in plain clothes entered again, flanked by two officers. Tanya didn't even look up. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the small room, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, unable to meet their gaze. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, like a storm waiting to break. The officer who had first brought her in, the one with the cold, calculating stare, moved to the side, standing with his arms crossed. The plainclothes officer placed a thick folder on the table in front of her, his expression unchanged. Tanya's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at the folder. She knew without asking that whatever was inside it wasn't going to make things better. "We've been in contact with federal authorities," the man said, his voice cool and detached. "They're aware of the situation. We'll need to run some more background checks, but this situation is serious. Do you understand that?" Tanya nodded weakly, though she wasn't sure she could trust her voice to speak without betraying the panic she felt inside. Federal authorities? This was becoming bigger than she could have ever imagined. What was happening to her? What had she been dragged into? She had no answers, only questions, and they were driving her mad. "Let me ask you again," the officer continued, leaning forward slightly, "do you recognize the people in those photos?" He gestured to the pile of images still spread out on the table between them. Tanya stared at the photographs, at the faces of strangers frozen in time. The more she looked, the more her stomach churned. No, she didn't recognize any of them. But then again, maybe she didn't want to. The possibilities were too terrifying to even consider. Whoever had taken these photos was methodical, precise. They had made sure she wouldn't see anything until it was too late. "I don't know who they are," she said, her voice shaking now, her fingers curling into fists on her lap. "I've never seen them before." The officer remained silent for a moment, studying her with an inscrutable look on his face. Tanya couldn't tell if he believed her or not. She wasn't even sure what to believe herself anymore. The fear that had been growing in her chest since she stepped off that plane now gripped her like a vice. The more she learned, the less she understood. "We've been tracking this group for a while," the officer finally said. "They're part of a larger network that's been involved in a variety of illegal activities, human trafficking, organized crime, smuggling. We believe they've been using ordinary people like you to move things under the radar." Tanya's breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun, trying to process the information. Human trafficking? Smuggling? She was just an ordinary woman. What had she gotten herself into? She hadn't signed up for anything like this. She had no connections to any of this. She had never been involved in anything criminal. But the pieces weren't fitting together. Her bag had been tampered with. She had been followed. And now, the police were suggesting that she was unknowingly a part of a larger conspiracy. "This is not your fault," the officer continued, his tone softening slightly, though it didn't make her feel any better. "But the fact remains, your bag was being used as a mule. It's possible that you were unknowingly carrying something very dangerous." He gestured to the photos again. "These people, they might have seen you as an easy target. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Someone who wouldn't even realize they were being used." Tanya was numb. She wasn't sure if she should be angry or scared. Maybe both. The officer's words rang in her ears, but they didn't seem to make any sense. How had she been dragged into something like this? How had they made her an accomplice without her even knowing it? Her mind began to race with the implications. If this group was as dangerous as they seemed, what were they capable of? What would they do to her if they realized she had turned against them? What would they do to anyone she loved? Tanya didn't know, but the terror that curled in her stomach told her that whatever it wasn't something she could face alone. The officer sat down across from her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Look, I know this is a lot to take in. And I know you're scared. But we're not going to let anything happen to you. We'll protect you. We'll make sure this doesn't go any further." Tanya's eyes locked onto his, desperate for any sign of reassurance. She had no idea if she could trust him, or anyone in this room for that matter. She was caught in a web of lies and deception, and she didn't know how to escape. But she had no choice but to believe him. For now, he was her only hope. Do you have anyone you can contact? Someone who can help? The officer asked gently. Tanya's heart dropped as the weight of his question settled on her. She thought of her family, her friends. She thought of the people who loved her, the people she would never want to put in danger. She thought of her life, the life that was slipping away from her, piece by piece. She thought of the countless decisions that had led her to this moment, and the devastating one she would have to make now. She shook her head. I don't know who to trust anymore. The officer nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. We'll take care of everything. Just stay calm. We'll handle the rest. But in that moment, Tanya realized that there was nothing calm about this situation. Nothing would ever be the same. She had been thrust into a world she never knew existed, and now she was fighting to survive it. She didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain, she would have to make a choice. A choice that would change everything. As the officers began to leave, Tanya felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The door clicked shut behind them, and she was left in silence once more, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it.